So I think now it's my turn before the break. So I'll continue on this topic in a much narrow aspect. And when I open my presentation, I just want to make one more comment. Some time ago, me and Gu were involved in a project studying how the concept of intellectual capital and well-being were recognized among small and medium-sized companies. And we did a research in over 40 companies in 3 different countries, and came across an issue that Andrea just raised about the terminology and how we call things. And the thing was that none of the managers in these small companies recognized the concept of intellectual. If you tell them intellectual capital, half of the people said, "What? I feel being like tested." I'm citing the feedback from the interviews I made that time. And then we got together, a team of scholars working on the issue, and we decided we'll change the questions and ask them. And our top question, I still regard this as a top question, was, how do you create value? And they came up, they opened up. And what another thing which I found very interesting was that it depends very much in the context, in the country. And in UK context, when you say the term intellectual capital, they become very touchy. And they connect it to academics, to universities, people being posh or boost on their knowledge, and that had kind of a negative connotation among people from small and medium-sized enterprises. So they use another terms. And when you break down intellectual capital to its comprising elements, they have them all. They acknowledge them all, and they automatically, or so to say, even sometimes subconsciously work with them. They use them, but they don't put them on paper. They don't put them, they don't formalize them. That's why maybe it was so hard to measure them, so hard to manage them. What we found out, that people who acknowledge them and actually manage them, being it consciously or subconsciously, they do perform well. But then I had this problem with measuring performance. And the problem with measuring performance is that sometimes you have to wait several years, or you have to do a longitudinal study, which is very costly and hard to do. So part of the thing is bothers me as a researcher is how to measure performance and sustainability in the long term. And now I'll continue with my present research topic. So this is an experimental study, so to say, and it's the very, very first stage. So it's me and a colleague of mine called Mina Daskalova, and she's a scholar who works in finance management, and she's interested in management control. And one day we got together and she told me, I want to do something together with you, let's work together and let's share our ideas and let's see what comes out of it. And to be honest, I don't know what will come out of it. Because accountants, people from finance management, they're very focused on measuring things. And me coming from the field of intellectual capital, well-being and intangibles, as you already know, it's hard to measure and it's more broad concept, and I didn't know how to combine this. But we started reading, and so it's in the stage of this literature review and reading different things and testing ideas. Several questions raised. And one of the questions is that when I was reading and looking to practice and some other academic papers, and one of the questions was that actually a lot of good strategies fail. And we are very, I'm also doing a lot of research and working in the field of strategic management from intellectual capital and knowledge management perspective. But we know what to do, and sometimes we have good strategies, but when we start to putting them in practice, for the first year things go okay, then we start to lag behind, and sometimes we completely forgot about our strategy. And one of the things is that strategies are performed by people, and sometimes people are not very well trained how to execute them, how to implement them. They aren't aware. The second issue we've been looking was management control, and why we came to this, what I found out is like management control is a good tool to keep things on track, to keep strategy on track and going. But when we started talking about the concept of management control, we came to the fact it's very formalized, it's very rational, and it's very measurable, most of the frameworks or theories about this. And I thought it would be interesting to look to management control from the perspective of knowledge-based strategy. And here later on you'll see there's a paper we worked on, like maybe over 5 years ago, looking to this tangible and intangible asset, and I thought maybe I should look to this and how management control would look from this framework. Then I thought to investigate the relationship, it would be wise to investigate the relationship between management control and intellectual capital and how these frameworks cover or support each other. And finally, my colleague suggested to use Simon's levers of control framework and IC elements and see how this works. To be honest, yesterday I was very optimistic, today I'm not so optimistic that it will work. So let's see in a moment what happens. So, as I said, a lot of good strategies fail due to pure execution, and this is because people just employees don't understand them. They aren't aware, they're not fully involved, and more here are behavioral scientists, human resource scientists or social scientists, and know that if people are not involved and committed, they fail, or sometimes they don't have the resources, or sometimes people don't have the framework needed to do it. Management control systems are meant to influence human endeavor and control people to perform right, to do things correctly. That's their, how to say, good intention. But I'm not sure it works always in practice. I have, some of you know, some administrative duties, and some time ago the accountants in my department said, oh, you know, we have to test our management control system, and they wrote a letter, and I saw to the document saying, okay, it's a very good document. To be honest, I haven't looked to this formalized internal control system that we are obliged to have as a university. And it was a very good intentions, very well written document. But believe me, as a practitioner, I doubt we actually effectively apply in practice all that we need to apply. It stays more on paper. So the ideal purpose of management control system is to provide information useful in decision making, planning, in evaluation. And former studies suggest that management control system should be tailored explicitly to support the strategy of a business to lead to competitive advantage and superior performance. And as we see, all fields of research, of management studies are trying to achieve the same thing. Better performance, sustainable competitive advantage, doing things better. But how do things look from strategy? Knowledge-based strategy perspective. So we regard knowledge as a primary intangible asset, and already I won't stop that much because we are here all agree it's due to transfer. As a result of knowledge transfer that we create value. Knowledge is created by people in their interactions with each other and in the environment, and here I agree with Andrea, but also they are all equal. But you can't have any of the other elements without the human being. Knowledge is embodied by people. So if we don't have the people, we lose it all the other. So here is a tricky part, how to cope with this challenge. And what my colleague, when we were discussing this quite informally, this paper, said, you know what, she was struggling to explain me, because I keep on, you know, Mina, what is this management control? I still can't, I mean, it's, and she said, okay, management control is applied from people to the people for the good of people. And it was again people. But you need knowledge. What I came, when I start thinking is, you need a lot of knowledge to have a good management control. So this is one of the things. What is knowledge management? So, and because we have a lot of tension with this, we play with these concepts a lot. Intellectual capital, intangibles, knowledge management. So I'll go back to an old definition that knowledge management is the art of creating value from an organization, intangible assets. And I think it's a good, how to say, standing point for people who are not very familiar in this field. And from IC point of view, it's critical to acknowledge that we have not all results that we produce are tangible. And I'm going to show you our framework model we came to with GUI some time ago. And they are generated both by tangible and intangible resources in constant interaction. So it's a process, it's a flow, and there's transformation between the key elements, and you can transform human capital into structural capital and to relational capital. Because it's through our interaction we create this intellectual capital, this relational capital, this image, this brand, and how things are going. We also use our knowledge, which is again we as people, to create this structural capital. And if we don't have this, we don't have the framework to get this. And here's the model. So as you see, we have tangible resources and intangible resources. We have both physical and financial capital, and in the middle this is a small picture of the intellectual capital. I don't know. So here this is part of the what we call intellectual capital. And you should regard this in a total transformation. I don't have this dynamic now. So we have both tangible and intangible output, and we can have monetary revenue and non-monetary revenue in terms of image, relationships, and all these things that help you create value. So you reinvest this. That's when you have this loop here, and that's the new era. That's the time we live in, and everybody now, I think, is agreed this is the reality and we have to go with. However, we did this in 2011. Now it's 2018, and what worries us all is that we haven't found a solution. Accounting hasn't changed much since that time. Neither financial management has changed, and we try to figure it out. Not much of the management control system have changed. And we thought, what framework, what we can do to change things in practice. Because being in management studies, we have to do a lot of practical, I mean, one of the challenges is not only to look to issues theoretically, but give these companies, when we study this, people ask us, why do you do that? What's the benefit for us? So one of the challenges I'm interested in is like providing companies a useful tool that can help them in their day-to-day practice to improve this. So maybe looking to some useful framework for management control system that can help them support and imply in practice the strategies that are knowledge-based that they develop might be helpful. Because as I cite here, the management control is designed to ensure that day-to-day tasks performed by all participants in organization come together in a coordinated set of actions lead to overall goal specification and attainment. So companies, they need to achieve their goals. I mean, that's why they exist. That's how they create value. That's what they look for. So I looked to the Simon's levers of control framework, and it has 4 control systems that work together to the benefit of a firm, and it consists of beliefs, the core values of the companies, the boundary, something we talked about, do we need them or not, the diagnostics, the monitoring, and interactive element, forward looking management involvement. So how we can use this, and how we can, is it a applicable framework to use from a business strategy perspective to monitor it. So the levers of control framework asserts that strategic uncertainty and risk drive the choice and use of control system, which in turn impact the organization through organizational learning and the recent use of management attention. So I quite like this because it links very much to some of the issues that we have from the perspective of knowledge-based strategy. And this drives managers to look for some useful framework that help them achieve both high degrees of learning and innovation in companies, cope with this, and at the same time manage to control it. Because why do we need to measure? We said it's hard to measure, maybe we don't need, but part of the thing is that management needs to control things. So the thing is, how much of it do we need to control, or do we need to control at all? But if we don't have some level of control, the system, the organization will become quite unstable. So what my colleague suggested me to look at, because I introduced her to the concept, and at some point in my life I've broken down intellectual capital to a very narrow, trying to measure it, elements. She looked to my elements, and these are that's how you can break down the intellectual capital if you go in depth trying to measure it. We have human capital, structural capital, relational capital, before we combine them. And these are some of the elements. And the first, so we combine both now, the levers of control, Simon, and intellectual capital framework. And the first one, the diagnostic control system, is used to motivate, monitor, and reward achievement of goals set, and is related to key performance metrics based on strategy. So this is a tool that is used to communicate strategy, motivate employee, and hold them accountable for the actions. And me and my colleague for now consider that these elements of human capital, its knowledge, competence, skills, the health, both mental and physical, and workability, this element will, could be related to this part of this lever of control of the diagnostic control system. Then the structural capital to its evaluation appraisal system, the quality management system, the production organization and management system, and database and information management system can help support the diagnostic control system, and the reputation of Mina and image of organization as elements of relational capital can support this first lever. Then if we look to the boundary system, here it's much more about the personal attitude of human capital, the organizational culture and lifestyle, and the relationships with different stakeholders, being them customers, suppliers, competitors, some other trade unions, or the reputation again and image of the organization can be relevant to boundary control system, which is used to set limits on opportunity-seeking behavior and to protect employees from deviations in their behavior, so keeps system stable. And the next, for the belief system, here what we can take from human capital are the commitment and motivation part. From structural capital, we look to the working climate in the organization, the different measures to foster creativity in the innovation management. And in terms of relational capital, we can look to some interesting issues, which are again tricky, like knowledge transfer and exchange and fostering that, because it's a very, touchy question for knowledge management schoolers, because we say knowledge shared is knowledge doubled on one level, but immediately we have opposition as somebody says, yes, but if knowledge is your key asset, your key intangible, which differentiates it from all the rest, if you share it, then what Andrea said, if you formalize it in terms of intellectual property, you tend to lose your competitive advantage, because two people can do, well, when in terms of knowledge, never two people can do one and the same thing, ever. So this maybe keeps us, leaves the door open. So this belief system, control system is used to inspire and direct in search of new opportunities. While the first two systems, the diagnostic and boundary control system, apply purely rational approach, the belief system appeals to employees' emotions. And here, employees are much more emotionally involved. And I would like to open a small bracket here and say something which is, I find, quite important development in recent management studies. For many years, for decades, management studies were very much focused on rational approach and trying to formalize everything. And I think this was because for us, for humans, it's hard to understand our surrounding world, and we try to rationalize it to make it more easily manageable. But the reality is, world is not rational. And emotions do impact on management, whether we acknowledge it or not. So your emotions, your attitude to people, your reactions, they impact on daily basis. And sometimes they impact on the how you take your decisions, how you implement your strategy. So they should be acknowledged. There were some articles like manage your emotions or the emotions will manage you. This is a Harvard Business Review article from several years ago. But the thing is, we can't always manage our emotions. It's a hard thing to do. We're not rational creatures, so we should look at, it's like tangible and intangible. We should look both, rational and maybe kind of irrational approach. Even mathematicians have rational and irrational and acknowledge the existence of both. So maybe here we should think how to cope with that. And then that, you see, I don't see measure, we need to cope. And the final lever is the interactive control system, which is used to stimulate search and learning, allowing new strategies to emerge as participants through the organization respond to perceived opportunities and threats. So this system focuses attention on strategic uncertainties and enables strategic renewal in terms of sometimes you need to adapt your strategies to the changed environment. So here my colleague looked to the element of working experience, which is also element of human capital. In terms of structural capital, the organizational structure, and the relational capital, again, different relations with different stakeholders like customers, suppliers, competitors, financial institutions, professional organizations, and the trade unions. So, I mean, this is the stage where we reached, and we are not, how to say, we're very optimistic, but not 100% sure if this merge between these two overarching broad concepts can work. So would be very happy to hear your comments, questions, suggestions, and a quick challenge for us will be how to study this in practice. Should we maybe follow the case study approach? Maybe the questionnaire won't be the best thing to do, but we can give it a try. Of course, this is the theoretic framework, and when we study, if we do some questions, obviously they will study these elements, but they will be formulated in a more acceptable to the practice and to the people from companies' way, or just as Andrea suggested, go there, ask them, how do they control if their strategy is implemented? Do they think their strategy is suitable in the new environment, in the knowledge-based economy? Does it cover or take into consideration the impact of intangibles? How do they control that? So this is from me, and I'm happy to hear your comments, questions, and anything you want to share. Yes. Okay, this was the first.
Thank you, Lidia. Thank you for the next very stimulating presentation today. I like like your approach and I wish you full success in putting in these empty boxes the right name of the factor in all these empty places. And what I want to say is wishing to help you. I think that case study approach and comparing case studies is the right path to go in further, because all this questioning in all these quantitative and qualitative methods should be compared very carefully. I insist that in this very nice subject and the beginning of your study, quality is more important than statistics.
Yeah,
yes.
Qualitative study.
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
Thank you for your
insist in this comparative case study methods. I think it will be full success in your study.
Okay. Thank you for the comment. So next question. Good.
Two comments. First of all, thank you for reminding of this our article from 5 years ago. I still think it's very important, and our basic message was that it is important to take into account these two kinds of outputs: the financial or the tangible outputs and the intangible outputs. Karl-Erik Sveiber, when he realized the whole idea of the knowledge-based economy, that was the thing that he realized, that if you don't take into account that you produce these two kinds of outputs, then you end up with wrong decisions. He created a game, this, what's the game's name?
Tangonet.
Tangonet, the game, in which he simulates a situation where a company in practice, all companies, they generate tangible and intangible outputs, but in some people, some managers take that more into account than others, and he managed to show that when you simulate companies year after year their business results, those who take into account the intangible outputs, which always in the first place reduce the tangible outputs. That's the dilemma. If you produce more intangible output, you produce directly less tangible output. And who wants to do that? Who wants to produce less money? But that is the idea. You have to stand making less money in the short run in order to make more money in the long run. That's the idea. So I'm glad you took it up again. And the other comment is that when I look at your presentation, I again realize why we have the difficulties. It's that you were discussing. The reality is far too complex. That was the merit of the original accounting system that was created 500 years ago. It's fairly simple. And that's the reason why Kaplan and Norton are so successful. They made a fairly simple framework. They said that take these 4 approaches, put there 5 of your most important indicators and concentrate on them. And always when we are talking about these things, we look at the whole reality, and it becomes so complex that even we ourselves get exhausted. That's constantly our dilemma. But we have to remind ourselves about it all the time.
So thank you. It's a good. I was start thinking about this balance scorecard and said, why are you going there when you have something more simpler, simple and more applicable, practical.
But of course, Kaplan and Norton, they realized that this 500 years old system was outdated. We can't manage with that system. That's important. It has to be more complicated, but it can't be too complicated. That's the problem.
One more, the last suggestion. If you continue to work in your international team, maybe it's a good perspective to put, so to say, cultural factor, cross-cultural factor. It's very important and influences to all this, for example, health, workability, and all these things, organizational culture. Even I didn't mention organizational climate. it's more precise than culture.
Yeah, we look them differently.
You can find a place and make this as a case study, comparative case study between Finland, Bulgaria, UK maybe, or whatever. Cultural factor is very important in this complex surrounding we are living nowadays. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you for this remark. Just to say you that in this study, in this project that we worked, studying intellectual capital, work and well-being, we did a cross-cultural study between 3 countries. And maybe it will be interesting to know, I'll share this result because I think I presented it once in my public lecture many years ago, and maybe you're aware, so I haven't talked about these ideas in our department, unluckily, but one of the key findings, which was very interesting finding to me, and came as a surprise, was about the concept of well-being. And it was an European Union project study, and we made some recommendations. And the fact was that the concept of well-being was understood completely differently in the cultural context of Finland, Scotland and Bulgaria. In Finland, it was related very much to work-related well-being and workability. At that time in UK, they were very much into work-life balance, and that's what they understood behind this concept. And what was very interesting about the reality in Bulgaria, and I think it will be interesting for the audience here, because we had a lot of underpaid labor. And when you say well-being, even the literal translation, I had to struggle with that for months on end, is благосостояние, which means how much money you have. So that was the key finding. And then I came with a special translation to the term in Bulgarian, which is усещане за удовлетвореност, which links much more to how satisfied, happy you are, which is the actual meaning of the term well-being. It's not well-being, it's not only about money. Money are just instrument. But because here the underpaid work is such a painful issue that any person you approach when you interview them, people immediately, on the 13th second from the conversation, they start raise the issue of payment, salary, and it was a very, it's like, I see it like a wound. If you just touch it and people go like this and start talking about the salary and being underpaid for the efforts and for their performance. And when we talk about performance, there's some interesting studies on that, by the way. I think one of them was, it's a very nice book, luckily I don't remember the author, but it was a Cambridge economist professor. And he said the 22 laws of economics that are not true. And he said about the appraisal of labor in different countries and how much effort you put and how this is evaluated. And he compared a bus driver in Stockholm and in India. That was one of his cases.
He received the Nobel Prize
years
ago.
For this.
I don't remember the name too.
Yeah, so here, and he explained this theory, and we are in a similar situation, unluckily in Bulgaria. And this was one of the problems when we talk about trying to measure intangibles, because on a similar conference about knowledge management and intellectual capital issues, there was a colleague from Germany, and he was trying to evaluate this, and I'll never remember that sentence. And he said, we have to have a stepping point, and we'll step on something which we can measure, and one of the things we can measure is labor. And at that point, I burst out laughing very loudly and very politely in the room. And then he stopped and said, obviously this is not the case in some parts of the world. So we never know. So these cross-cultural issues are really relevant, and thank you. And Andrea had something to say. I'm sorry for the long...
No worries. I was just wondering, since maybe I'm confused and I don't completely understand it, but since you put the management control levers into intellectual capital components, what's the use of using the management control levers as a concept? Because basically what I actually understand is that management control levers are intellectual capital. So basically, and they are intellectual capital flows. So if you're only going to look at the management activities of management control, then you're only looking at the flows of management activities. So how is that going to help the companies make sense of the flow that is happening once you don't have any stocks of it that are being moved by those flows?
Thank you for the question. We have to think about it. That will be the right answer, because when you said, I like your part, so intellectual capital is management control. When I saw what my colleague did, and she basically did it a couple of days ago with this, and I said, what do you mean by that? And how is that going to work? Because it's the same thing. But what I find as a scholar very often is that actually what I find, and that's why I like these cross-disciplinary studies, that many of us are trying to solve same problems from different perspectives. And when we get together only to find we have similar problem, and we are looking into the same thing. So the management control comes how this some of them immeasurable items can be controlled. So because to me, to be honest, I'm more on the strategy management perspective, so it's more planning and looking forward. But I've never thought about the controlling part. So now just the two things fit together. But when the balanced scorecard will be more reasonable approach, I'll still have to think which will work better than the two. But we need to be together to comment on that and see if we stick to that framework or we don't. Because you're right, they basically are very, very close, and the thing is how to control this, and I'm not sure.
I was thinking in the terms of how are you going to put it together as a tool? That's the other thing, because that's going to be quite complex to actually put it together in a framework in order to work. Because in the end, you have loads of intellectual capital elements over there, but they don't necessarily overlap. And my feeling is that those diagnostic controls are just going to feed one into another. They're not going to be that
give any relevant information. Actually, what I was thinking now, and this reminds me of a research approach. So this is a little bit slightly different subject, but because it's a working seminar, I'll go there into that field because I think it's relevant to all of us. How to do the research. And maybe it's interesting to my colleagues to know that for many years in our department, though we're from different departments, but same faculty of management, the research approaches, with which I had some years problem, and it's you put a framework, you read theory, and then you come up with a framework or a model trying to describe the reality, and then we artificially try to put it on practice, and we struggle to make it work, and it's not working, and we have problems, and we try to prove it will work. When I got to work in an international concept, I had another colleague I worked in with that project, Professor Linda McKee, and he knows we had some struggles at some point. Research struggles quite severe. Said, no, this is not the right approach. You should go into the companies, study the practice, forget all the theory, look what they think, look at what they do. So that's, I think, this case study approach, and what you say is, look, ask them what they do, and then go to what you think as a model and try to see if it works, and maybe it won't be that model, it will be something else. So maybe it will be the right approach just to go and talk to people, see what they do. We can keep our framework or our theory in our hand and see how the reality, what they do in practice fits into this, and how to, and then describe the model. Instead of coming in the morning with a model that nobody has a clue about it, unless he's academic and try to, impose it. So, but we have this problem in this research approach. So these are two different approaches. One is very rational, and it's management, and we are industrial management. So very formalized, very rational. And the professor was sociologist, so it's another. That's how these two work.
Lidia, now I'm thinking that in the process of this developing case study, comparative case study, let's say, you we'll be able to construct some kind of types of management control systems in different kinds of organizations.
Yeah.
And in this case, for your research should be, maybe it will be very helpful this approach in organizational culture. Probably you know this diagnostic of organizational culture.
Yes,
this famous
Hofstede.
book. Yeah, not Hofstede, Kim and Cameron, professor from Chicago and Cambridge, the second one.
Okay, thank you for that input.
And they put these different types as a result of case study analysis of different types of organizational cultures. So maybe it will be next step during this comparative study.
Thank you. Any more questions? Maybe we can continue our discussion over a cup of coffee because I think we are all desperate. So I invite you in the cafeteria and you can get coffee or anything.